I really struggled with how to start about the role of the supervisor. So I thought I'd start with a story which goes something like this. I'd only just got my PhD when I was walking down a corridor and the prof said, "Get in that room now, we need you." And that was my first ever experience of supervision. And my feelings were something like this. And it's the only way I could think to encapsulate those feelings was this, just this little clip. Read PhD supervision. And it was a bit like that. Immense feelings of being scared, of not being worthy, of what do I need to do, what is this all about. I'd had no training whatsoever. There was none of these elaborate packages telling us what to do or how to do it. So it can be a very scary experience. But I do want to start with some positives. Because for me, PhD supervision is the best part of my job. It's that stimulates me, it's the oxygen that I breathe, that on my research. And these are from some experienced supervisors that say things like, "This is the most satisfying thing I've ever done." Significant achievement. That these relationships, this work is very positive. And that for very many of these people, that this work is the most satisfying, the most positive, and that they develop long life friends. And that's certainly my experience of supervision. That's a heck of a commitment to be involved with. The person that supervised me, my old prof, is still in contact with me, still tells me what I should and shouldn't be doing, and sends me sometimes barbed emails about my work, which I take in good grace these days. But it's really important that this is a commitment that needs real time given to it. So satisfying, positive, and the potentiality to make lifelong friends and good academic partners. At Liverpool Hope, we really value these relationships. We value this sort of work. But we realise that it's not always the easiest thing to be involved with. There is a large series of training organised by the university and now by us that helps you sort of deal with some of the issues about the regulations, about how you examine, about how you deal with the viva, about how you prepare for the viva. There are also chances to gain experience, not as many as we would like over the last few years, to gain experience of the supervisory process. And there is also this notion that we want people to start as research advisors and eventually end up as directors of studies. We do see this as a career pathway, about gaining experience while you're here and working with the students that we have here at Liverpool Hope in the education faculty. That's what we're committed to. And what we've tried to do on every supervisory team that's in the education faculty is actually have a research advisor, someone learning the trade, shall we say. And we've also looked across the university as well to all the supervisory teams that are out there to see if we can place people. But I am very aware, and we've had a conversation this morning, that for some people it's very difficult to make that first step onto the team. So some good news. Over the next certainly year to 18 months, there's going to be a number of EdDs coming through that are going to require supervisors. So if you're not signed up as a research advisor already, if you've not filled the form in from Sarah and I, it's probably a good thing to do as a result of today's event to get your experience vetted, to see where you're going to fit in relation to the teams. So you can start as a research advisor. If you've got some completions and some experience, you can then apply to be a research supervisor. And I'm there to help and guide on that as well. So one of the things I want to make really clear at the start is this. We may have been ourselves excellent PhD students. We may have found the whole process fantastic, interesting, exciting, and not had a problem with it. That's not my experience, but there are some people like that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we will go on and make good supervisors. I do believe, essentially, it's a craft that we learn and we keep on learning. And certainly I'm still learning now in the experiences that I'm having only today with students. We learn all the time. And most of us, at the beginning of the process, and certainly even 5, 10, 15, 20 years on, still need guidance about how we do this. Because each supervisory relationship, I believe, is completely and utterly unique. I've never been involved in one that's the same. There are similarities, but each student is unique, each topic is unique, and each time in your life and that student's life is a unique time. And it's that sort of colliding of things that makes this, I think, such a wonderful experience. So what then I hear you ask is the role of the supervisor? Well, some people say you are a teacher, you teach them stuff. That you are a trainer, you train them in stuff. That you are a mentor, you mentor them in stuff. Other people though, and don't they quite go this far? You could be a father or a mother. This is one of the dilemmas of supervision, is knowing how much to give and how much to stand at some distance. My own belief is it has to be a professional relationship. It is a professional relationship. But it is very easy to get dragged into more than a professional relationship. I am not here to say that that is wrong, because there are some supervisions with some of the students that you're with who go through quite horrendous life experiences. For some people, 3 years full-time, 6 years part-time, that's a considerable length of somebody's life. If something doesn't go wrong in that period, I think you're doing rather well. I've had students that have been beaten up by partners, have ended up in refuges, that have lost jobs when they've been working. All of these things will happen, and more during the time. I don't think to date I've had a single supervision that's ever not had something go wrong during the period in terms of the other stuff. So it is very, very easy to be drawn in. And again, I don't want to say that's wrong, but you've got to maintain, in terms of the actual work, this professionalism. According to experienced supervisors, they say that it should have a training focus. You should help to shape the research by providing technical research support and guiding the students through what someone articulated as the research milestones. It's also argued that for the PhD supervisor was this notion of fostering development. You are trying to make or help make an independent researcher. A doctorate is the start of a research career, it's not the end, but we want to equip these students with a range of skills to enable them to go on and have a career. I'll talk a bit more about later. But you are there to work creatively and foster development. I think that this phrase is really important. I think as a supervisor, we can put the regs to one side for a moment. You have to have a desire to inspire the student, to enable them to achieve these amazing things. And what I really like about the supervisory arrangement is the way those conversations develop over numerous years, where you get to the stage where the student's starting to really take you on in terms of your knowledge. You've put the inspiration in, you put the perspiration in, the working with them, and you get to that stage when they start to run free of you. And they start to make you think that you have to read and you have to do more work to keep up with them. It's an absolutely delightful development if it goes well. But this desire to inspire is really, really important. And experienced supervisors say that we do this by providing an intellectually challenging research environment. In the supervisions that I've seen that have gone wrong when I've been involved in appeals, and I've been involved in a number of appeals, it's because the supervisors have missed something. We'll talk about the regulations in a moment, but this notion to intellectually challenge, we have to push the students to make that top grade of level 8. But if we push them too much, we can push them over the edge. It's a very delicate balance. We have to provide advice and constructive criticism. I've certainly worked with one appeal where they were told that everything was great. Nothing was wrong. It was a brilliant piece of work. And then they got to Viva and people tore it to pieces. And they'd not experienced that sort of academic debate and were unprepared for it. So my belief is that from the very word go, we have to challenge what's said. And we challenge by asking people to provide evidence. And we slowly turn that challenge up as we go through the process, as the students get more capable of working within that remit. We cannot just allow the students to sort of bumble by and write stuff and say, yeah, that's fine. And I know sometimes that we're all very, very busy. And it's very easy just to put a few comments down the margin, as I saw at one university, you need to put an A on that, cross that T. You've really got to read it and make comments. And the way I supervise is that I say to my students right at the start, you'll get a lot of comments down the margin. And as the time goes by, I'm hoping that those comments in the margin will reduce because you're hitting the level and you're pushing me to think hard. And that's the way I work with my students. So we have to challenge them, we have to push them, and we have to do it constructively. We also have to train them in some practical skills, and again I will come down to that. But this notion of inspiring and stimulating and a sense of wonder and excitement. If someone had said to me that I would have gone off and done a PhD when I was at school, I would not have believed them. But I was lucky enough to have a really tough supervisor. But what he always did was inspired and stimulated me. He provided an intellectually challenging environment. He pushed me. He had this real notion and knowledge when he could push just that little bit more and when he needed to step back. Now that does come through experience. But we have from the very beginning to take on these relationships as intellectually challenging. So the desire to inspire. And then we come to this, pastoral care. This is another significant part of a supervisor's role. There is pastoral care in terms of the academic work, careers advice, and that's where I'm seeing pastoral care. But we always have to be mindful of the student when they turn up. You will get to know your students really well, and you almost sometimes get a sense that something's not going well, that something's not right. And you need to know where you can direct these people to the services in the university, counselling services and so on. Again, one of my faults as a supervisor, I've been told it's a fault, is I do get too involved. I think it's difficult sometimes not to when things in people's life are falling apart. You see a fantastic PhD student potentially going off the rails. A PVC at a previous university said that I invest too much in people as a supervisor. I get too involved. I do too much. I don't think I see that as a fault. I think you just have to be mindful that's part of your character. But we have to be there for them when the time isn't going well. We have to be there for them before we start, giving them advice before we start the process, during, and as I said before, all the way afterwards. We provide this continuity of advice and pastoral support for them, going on many years into the future. We have to be interested in them and their work. We have to be available, and we'll talk about that again in a minute, and critical, supporting and encouraging. If we just look at some of those words, that's really difficult, isn't it? Got to be interested, got to be available in our busy careers when we've got all the undergraduate stuff to do, the master's stuff to do, writing our own papers. We've got to be critical, supporting and encouragement. Wonderful CV, we can put all of those down. We provide guidance and support at times of need, overall perspective, inspiration. But when the going gets tough, you need to be there. Because in every PhD, every doctorate that I've supervised, there is always a period of when it gets tough. When they don't understand something, when they're struggling with something, when they want to give it up, but you know there is a student there who's absolutely superb. And it's your job to enable them to get through the milestones and get to the end, and to carry it going into the career advice later on. So pastoral care is a biggie, and it's a difficult one that I struggle with. This comes out of the review of the research on supervisors in terms of the Wellcome Trust PhD. So I believe, and it's a personal thing, but I think other people agree as well, that this relationship, this supervisory relationship, is built upon developing those relationships of mutual trust and understanding. I think of all the things, regulations and the rest of it, that is the most influential thing for determining the success or otherwise of your students. The relationship that you build with them. And I want to delve down into that. Not all the relationships will be the same. So we will have students, doctoral students, who start off very inspired, who get to a year, 18 months in when things get tough, who do want to get out of there, who want to give it up. I did in my own PhD when things started to get tough and someone said I needed to learn about complex factorial ANOVAs. I thought I had better things to do. But what I'm going to argue in this presentation is that we develop and we keep students on track by building relationships, and they are built on you acting as a teacher and a mentor. You being able to provide this inspiration that I've talked about, especially when times are tough. You know, this is good work. It's interesting work. It's novel work. It excites me. By providing the pastoral support, That's the foundations of good supervision, and all of those areas are tied together by this notion of building this relationship with your student. And all the other things I talk about in this presentation, I think, are subservient to that. I have to talk about some practical things that you need to do as well as a supervisor. When I did my PhD, there was some notion about skills training, but not a lot. You went and asked someone if you were stuck. But now the only legal aspect of a doctoral study, PhD study especially, is this notion of the vitae training and the vitae wheel. And I'm sure many of us have come across this. All students are introduced to this in their introductory sessions at this university, and we also run courses on the vitae wheel and the phases and all the rest of it. I don't want to do too much on that. I'll come back to it again towards the end of the presentation. But it is important to emphasise that it's not just about the content area of study. You also have a duty to enable your students to gain an appreciation of research methodology across a range of areas, not just what they're specifically working in. This vitae goes on into academic careers for you and I, although many universities haven't adopted it at our level yet, but it certainly is the future. So there is a notion of developing this wider range of skills. And you would have to come to the regulations. And you've got some on the sheet, and there's whole bundles of them, and code of practice. And then there's all of this stuff. But basically, training in research skills is mandatory at this university and all universities. We can't get around that. And I'll explain some ways we can deal with that during our supervisory meetings. The students have a duty to continually update what's called their personal development records. Minimally on a yearly basis for AMR, but I would argue much more than that. It's part of good supervision. And directors of studies and you as supervisors have to constantly monitor their performance in that area. You cannot submit your thesis unless your vitae skill development log is complete and signed off. That's how important it is. You can have the best thesis going, but if this isn't completed, you can't submit your thesis. So it's a biggie, and we'll talk about that. So, as an effective supervisor, then, I believe that you need, from the very beginning, to adopt a positive attitude towards training. I actually don't think it should be a separate thing. It's actually part of, I think, it really helps in reducing the isolation for students, getting them encouraged in going on conferences, seminars, training events that we offer in this university and elsewhere. I think you should be encouraging them, at your meetings about what's coming up, having an eye on the things that are happening in the faculty, looking to go with them, to do training with them as well. I think that's really important. This is part of what a PhD student is. We talk very much in ref documentation about the environment. Giving the PhD students and doctoral students an environment to go into that's riven with training events, supervisory meetings, conference seminars, doctoral days. We've run things like drop-in counselling sessions and doctoral dating sessions. I won't go into what they are at the moment, but it's all about building those. And as a supervisor, you should know about these things. And it's quite saddening sometimes when I speak to students around AMR time, when I speak to them individually, when they have no idea about a lot of the things that are actually going on in the faculty and in the university. Now, yes, they should know, but I would also argue as a supervisor you should know, because you should care about where they're going with their studies and with their training and so on. So we need to encourage them to attend things. Keep an eye on it. Talk about it regularly. What training are you doing? Where do you think your weaknesses are? What can I do to facilitate filling of those gaps? What can we go on together in terms of a conference, delivering papers together that will help address some of these issues that you've got? Constantly, I think that you should give time at your supervisory meetings to talk about things like this. In terms of the regulations at this university, the very first meeting that a doctoral student have, you should audit their skills. Because one of the mistakes we very often make is we assume that our students don't have a full range of skills, and particularly in terms of the Ed.D, there's a number of students come in from the Ed.D route who actually can sign off an awful lot of these skills. And so that audit is really important, so you don't just churn out your usual message, you need to go on this, you need to go on that. We need to provide bespoke training for them. And that comes through this first audit. Very important. So, Audit the skills at the first meeting, work out an individual package for the year of what they need to do, what they need to address, where you're going to work with them, where they're going to work independently. There are other things as well that this university does to support you as supervisors and research advisors and teams to get a handle on this skills training. I think it's important to reference that now. I've talked about VTAI, we run courses on VTAI. Everybody a few years ago was asked to go on the VTAI skills development, and a lot of people from this faculty did. But there was also a number of people who didn't as well, and considering it's the only legal part, it really surprised me. There's also, and this is not well known, a very expensive training package here about research skills online that provides research skills training. It has online modules, videos provided by some of the best researchers in this country, with quizzes and tests and certificates. And yet I speak to students over and over again who've never come across this, not been introduced to it. We run courses on this as well in terms of for supervisors and for students alike. It's a really great package. It costs the university several £1,000s a year to take this on. If you're ever stuck for training or where to go, Dr. Janet Speak, who's the Associate Dean for Postgraduate Research Students, is the font of all knowledge. She organises the university-wide training plan and our away day where we have a nice meal, and she also organises what's called the phases, which is how this university deals with skills training. Now I don't want to go into that at this meeting because there's all training on that in the calendar, but if you're not aware about how VTAI works, get yourself on a training thing because it's really important. So Janet, ably supported by Chris Lowry, are the people responsible for postgraduate training across the university. Okay. So I just want to recap where we are at the moment. What are we trying to say? I'm trying to squeeze this notion that the student doesn't want to be here. Yeah. They want to leave us. I've argued so far that we need certain building blocks if we're going to devise the sort of foundations of good research. And to that I've added this notion of research skills. That's part of our legal duty. In terms of regulations, again, there's loads more detail about how often we should be seeing the student. That's a question I'm very often asked, well, how often do we see them? Well, it's a minimum of 8 meetings a year, and that's the same, exactly the same for part-time students. Exactly the same. There should be no difference at this university, and that's unusual. But a few years ago, I remember auditing students, and one student had been coming for 100 odd miles for supervisory meeting, and a year he'd had 1 meeting because his supervisor was always busy, made the effort to get there, didn't materialise. There is a regulation of 8 meetings a year, and if the student doesn't have the 8 meetings a year, then you cannot pass annual monitoring. The other regulation is that it's normally face-to-face, and that does give us some flexibility to use Skype and other methods. I mean, I like to see the students, I like to sit and talk with them, but sometimes that's not always the case, especially when they're out on field work and working at some distance. So Skype is perfectly okay to use in terms of supervisory meetings, but you have to have a minimum of 8. And at AMR, once a year annual monitoring, I look through the 8 supervisory logs and I read all of them for all of our students, and we look at where the gaps are, and then we talk to the students about where they're finding difficulties in supervisory relationships. And the biggest one that always comes up is, I'm simply not seeing my supervisor enough. And students, we're a lot better at it than we used to be, but the minimum is 8. So, there's also notions on how we plan for a meeting, what we're supposed to do, how it's supposed to happen, yet still people don't do agendas and targets and minutes. And they're really important. According to our regulations, all meetings should be formally planned and recorded. There is a central form for education that we can put the minutes onto. And I would advise that we all read those minutes very carefully. It's not okay to just sort of file them away. Of all the appeals I sat on last year, one of the major parts of the appeal was the supervisory log, where students have been writing things unchallenged by supervisors. Yeah? So we need to read them, and if they're not right, we need to comment on them. The student should be responsible for those minutes. The student should be responsible for those targets, but you should work on them together to sign them off. And I would always store those on your own computer with every email as well, from the beginning of the process all the way through. Because if something does go wrong, and hopefully it won't do, those are the emails that will be drawn out by students. to support their case. In fact, in every one we've been involved with last year, everyone involved is email communication that had gone on. And many supervisors couldn't find it, but the students could. And unfortunately, we do live in a litigious climate, and many more students are now appealing. In fact, they're appealing in so many ways. So it's good practice. Store every email, store every minute, keep them for all of the period of the PhD or the doctoral student. They must submit them to you, you must sign them off, you must agree the targets and future outcomes. You should at the start of the year agree the outcomes for the year, what you're aiming for. What are going to be the major milestones that you're going to cover this year? As I say, I don't want to get too bogged down in the regulations. So. The other piece of advice I'd like to give is that as supervisors, we very often avoid the hard decisions. And this is one of them, the notion of unsatisfactory progress. It's this notion of, I think they'll be all right if we give them another month, and then another month becomes 2 months, or 3 months, or 4 months, or a year, or then just before Viva. I believe fundamentally that the first AMR at the end of the first year is absolutely crucial. Absolutely crucial. Some people can be fantastic master students, but can't be, or for some reason just can't work at sort of level 8, that junction between level 7 and level 8. And it may seem a tough decision, but I think it's a more humane decision, rather than keep people hanging on for 2 or 3 years without making decisions about whether their progress is unsatisfactory. And certainly I've been involved in cases where students have had sort of health problems because they're unable to do the work, but can't say for themselves that they want to stop. And this is one of the aspects of our job that isn't always very pleasant, but I think it's incumbent upon us as supervisors to make those decisions in guidance with people in the faculty. And some of the most difficult cases is because decisions have not been made early enough. So it's really important. And if you've got any questions about problems with a student or something that's not going right, come and talk to me. Or talk to Janet. And Janet's very, very good at listening and very knowledgeable about supervisory relations. And there's people here with vast amounts of experience. And I still talk to people when I have difficulty about, is this satisfactory or not? But make the decisions early. It isn't always final. And certainly one fairly recently where we put action plans in, that action plan was the single biggest thing that got the student back on track. And I have no doubt now that they'll finish and do very, very well. So don't let things slide. So it's important about unsatisfactory progress. Let's put part to one side. So we're there. You've got your first supervisory team. It's all set up. You're ready to go. You're going to start your first meeting with your new student. I think this first meeting is absolutely crucial. Absolutely crucial to setting the sort of store about how things are going to go for the next 3, 4, 5 years. So, some ideas maybe about how you could approach it. I think you should start by discussing mutual expectations. What does the student want? What do you want? That will be different for each student, from a mature student to an international student, to, depending upon the content. What do they expect out of this? What is their understanding of the process? I find a lot of PhD students and doctoral students actually elevate the thing. They make it much too complex. They try and do 99 PhDs in the space of 1 year. They don't realise that a rapier-like study is just as good. They overcomplex. Many of the students I've worked with, including me when I started, felt they weren't worthy to be there. A feeling of inferiority. And you've got to get a handle on that straight away. Mutual expectations about what you want to do, what you can do and what you can't do. Like coming in on a Saturday at 11 o'clock to discuss them because they missed a meeting in the middle of the week. Is to explain what your role is, and one of the major ones is to provide feedback. And I know Lynn's going to do a session later on about providing feedback at this level. There is going to be time when it's going to be about constructive criticism, and that may be tough to deal with, but it's done in their best interest. It's done about the study, not about them as a human being. And it's an important part of the academic process, and the end of it is about constructive criticism at the Viva. We need to agree the nature of the meetings, what they're about, the meetings, the targets, the agendas, what you expect, the frequency. That if you've booked a meeting and the student can't make it, that they should send an apology. And if you can't make it, you should send an apology. And that you will get feedback. And the practical arrangements for what's going on in terms of the meeting. So, I also think this last one's really interesting. Many of us go off and do field work, we disappear off, especially during the summer months. Well, what happens if something goes wrong? How do they get hold of you? And I think we need to sort of set that up at the first meeting, about if things are really desperate, this is what you need to do. These are the people you can contact and get hold of. You need to flag up when your main periods of hassle are marking, exams. And let them know, share that with your students so they know that, if you send a terse email, which I try not to do, it's probably because you're absolutely hammered with work and you're just struggling to keep your nose above the water. And I find that students, when they see your timetable and your marking thing, get it very quickly about the life of an academic. You need to look ahead about conferences, whether they'll be involved with grants and when you're involved with grants, so that they know. So involve them in what you're doing as an academic, I think is what I'm trying to say. So, general ideas for meetings. We must book dates in advance. I try to put them in for the whole year for each student, and they become inviolate or movable. There could be nuclear holocaust out there, we don't move a meeting, because I think that's mutual respect. I try very, very hard not to cancel a doctoral meeting. Especially if people are travelling, but just, if someone's made the effort to come see me, I think we should be there. I think, as we said, we need to allow time for pastoral issues, to talk about things, about the life in general, before we move into the sort of content study. We need to think about written inputs from students. I've always had this belief that students should write early and continue to write throughout all of it. I think very often in the supervisory relationship, we leave writing for too long. And then it becomes a bit of a thing. And I'm not saying it has to always be formalised writing. It could just be some notes or some diagrams, and then we try and formalise that. But very often people don't write early enough, and we can trace issues that we have later on back to that. I think we need to maintain a balance on achievements and criticism. Sometimes you've had a piece of work that's absolutely atrocious, and you can get quite irritated by it. Why waste my time sending this in? But you've got to temper that with what's gone on before. If a pattern starts to develop, that's different. But if it just arrives, you've really got to pull back. Well, that isn't as good as your last piece of work. I wonder why you went down that line. What is it about this that makes this different? And try and analyse it. So we've got to get this balance right between giving positive feedback and jumping in with this negative. We need to leave time and space for intellectual discussion. I sometimes get much too carried away with that, and we go off on a tangent. We used to call it at one university a Dollard digression, after John Dollard, who was a master at this. He'd start a meeting, and an hour later he'd finish what he was saying, because he just took it in his head and gone for it, and the student would be sat there going, when do we start the meeting? But we need to talk about things outside of the PhD that maybe fit onto the PhD, about maybe an academic paper or a conference, or where this work might go in the future. We had a really lovely conversation this morning with a PhD student about how this methodological approach had real merit. And it's something that could prove a useful furrow to dig for the next 2 or 3 years when the PhD is finished. We should agree what we've achieved. This comes back to the minutes. Spend some time to agree what you think you've achieved and what the student thinks they've achieved, because very often they can be different. You think you've really got your point over, but if you don't discuss that, then you get the next piece of work and it's the same, because you haven't made yourself clear. So, time for discussion, a balance, written input, intellectual discussion, and agreeing what you actually think you've achieved. And here's probably not how not to do it. Yeah? It reminds me of some supervisions that I've been involved in another university. Here's the student. He's totally onto me. He knows I've done nothing this week. I can see it in his disapproving eyes. He thinks I'm worthless. And the chap on the other side, I see interesting. Squash game with Professor Jones today, that old bugger. Which reminds me, I've got to pick up the dry cleaning. And what's that guy's name again? It happens. We are very busy people. We fade off. I think, and I don't always do it myself, but I think we should take the phone off the hook when the meeting's happening. We should take the phone off the hook, turn off the phones. Because it happens, it's happened to me, I'm sure, when the phone goes and suddenly you lose 5 minutes talking about something else, and then your mind goes off into that. That time is absolutely important for the student. It's important for giving feedback, for developing those relationships. And if you're constantly on the phone all the time, or I've certainly seen one very senior supervisor at another university doing her emails, our students talking to them. And I just don't think that's acceptable. I think you just need to shut the door, turn the phones off, switch the computer off, and talk about it. This wonderful thing that is the doctoral study. Well, this one, and I think this is a really important point. We said at the start that each individual supervisory team and student is different. That is incumbent upon you that you've got to have different styles for different supervisions. You can't be the same every time. And certainly I think that's what I thought when I first started to supervise. Well, I do this, I tell them about the skills, and I do that, and that's a supervisory meeting. But if actually listening, as Bab said, to your student and hearing them, very often the style will alter, and will alter throughout the course of the PhD. Sometimes you can start off really friendly, but you don't always end up that way. You have professional respect. Other times you can start off quite cagey. But it's about adopting a style to the person that's in front of you and the time in their life that's in front of you. And putting all this other stuff here to one side. That's really important, I think. So, the other thing about that I wanted to mention that's important to me, the supervisor as God. You always have a choice. It's simple. You either do what I tell you, or you give up, drop out, become a failure, a disappointment in the eyes of your friends and family. Is there a third option? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not telling you. Once I had a student, an international student, who came to see me about another supervisory team, who ended up on the floor crying. She'd been sponsored by a government to come over and do a PhD. For her to fail would mean family shame. She couldn't go home. So it's really important. You are not the arbiter of all facts. You know stuff, but you don't know everything. You have to take it back. And sometimes the student knows more than you on a particular issue. And you've got to monitor that and work with them. And I remember with my supervisor, who was particularly difficult, at one point we had this flaming row. And I felt like walking out, and he said, now you're a PhD student, I'm now following you. And it was a really interesting thing that after all that time, he'd been like that to push and get me to the level, and then he said, you know more about this than me now, I'm following, I'm supporting. And that's the way he supervised. Now I'm not saying that's the right way to do, but you cannot act in this role throughout the supervisory relationship. There will be times where you have to be deterministic. You need to get this in for the AMR or else. But you cannot be like that. It is not about your ego and your work. It's about the student and the student's work. Really important to say that. So, let's recap. Oh, hello. So, you need to consider questions of how much do you push, how much do you not push, when do you push, when do you allow the student to learn from their mistakes. I don't think there's any right answer to this. It depends on the relationship with the student that you're with at the time. How much should you do for them? In terms of telling them about it, I think it'd be really good if you use ferret juggling out of Mongolia with big sacks. It'd be a wonderful process because that fits into what I'm doing. How much do you adjust? These are not easy. If you're unsure, talk to people. That's what coffee's about. I still talk to people outside of this university that I've been involved in supervisory relationships when things aren't going well. And even when things are going well, I ask questions all the time. How would you do this? What would you do in this circumstance? If the students told you this, what would you do? So it is about developing the relationships within the team, but also within the faculty with people and more experienced colleagues here, people who've got a lot more experience than I have, and people that have supervised you in the past. There is very often no right or wrong answer. You've just got to go with it. It's not easy. So, to recap then, we know that building relationships is based upon these, and that we know we need to deal with the research skills, that we need to run effective supervisory meetings where we are in the room intellectually, we're not elsewhere doing something else, if we're to prevent the student from leaving us. One of the other roles I want to touch on briefly, which is dealt with in many other courses, is our job to communicate academic standards in terms of ethics, in terms of writing standards and so on. And also what happens if the student transgresses. It's very sad when you see students appeal that say, well, I didn't really realise that was problematic. It's also interesting appeals when you get supervisors saying that students have done something wrong when the supervisor's wrong because they've not read the regs. If you're at all unsure about the regulations, Sarah Meyer or Chris Lowry can help. And on top of those as well, there is the notion of ethics, which is dealt with very well here through the, hello David, on the ethics panel. If you're unsure, there's people like David to talk to, and more experienced colleagues as well. But part of our role is to sort of police this. It's very difficult. We had a meeting recently about plagiarism on PhD, and we all know it will never happen. Never happen. I walked out of the room to get an email of a script coming from another university where it was plagiarised. Having never dealt with it in all the years I've been supervising, I walked straight out. And I was at a loss. How could this get through? So we need to be very clear about the standards that we set and police those. And if we're not reading the work well enough, which obviously was happened at this university, that's why it hadn't been picked up. Another thing I'd like to just touch on very briefly is this notion of originality, because I've got 5 minutes left. This is something that students often struggle with, supervisors struggle with. What is original? It doesn't have to be earth-shattering, solve cancer, world poverty and all the rest of it, a doctoral study. It doesn't have to be that. There are a number of ways of gaining originality for your study. I think the important thing, there's a list here, is to talk about your student from the very outset. How does this make a contribution to the knowledge? Where do you think this is original? And keep those conversations going over the years. There are examiners whose first question is, finish this sentence, my thesis is original because. And students go, after 4 years or 6 years of working on something, they can't answer a basic question. So start those discussions early and continue to develop them. Originality can change during the course of a doctoral study. Certainly isn't what I'm involved with at the moment. It doesn't have to be the same. But you need to talk about it. So when that question comes, or a question like it at Viva, the student is well prepared for that. So, to recap then, I'm slowly squeezing out this notion of the student wanting to run for cover. Exam prep, we have sessions here, pulling it all together for Viva, which you can sign up for as supervisors, about how the student can bring that huge document together, how they should approach questions. There are people here that do really good mock Vivas for students that you can come and watch when they happen, or see videos of, or transcripts of. So there's lots of things that you can do to enable you to build these relationships. So this presentation will be going up eventually with a video on the research website for the faculty. I tried to summarise some points. There will be people here that say, I could add another 5 to that or a 10 to that. This is not a definitive list by any stretch of the imagination. It's just something that I found useful over the time. But I want to leave, really, with this point from my own personal experience. Enjoy it. Because I have. I'm not saying it's all been perfect, and it's not saying there's been times when it hasn't gone well. But when you sit outside the office, when your students being Viva, and you're sort of, stress is something else, and then suddenly the door opens and that big glow on the face and you hear the examiner saying, congratulations, Dr. So-and-so. There is no feeling, if you could bottle that, you'd make a fortune. It's the best thing I feel. It's far surpasses for me getting an academic paper published. That feeling that someone you've worked with for that length of time is now a doctor. And it's a wonderful... When I examine, I'm trying to get first over the table to shake the hand and say, congratulations, Dr. So-and-so. I was once outdone by a very notable professor who nearly sort of did herself a mischief. She got over the table before me, I won't mention her name. Very adept at sort of being the first to shake the hand. So enjoy the experience. It's really important in your academic careers to be involved with this, but enjoy it whatever happens. And we are here to help. There's a comprehensive range of programs to help and assist you, and personal people here that will talk to you at length about this. So thank you for listening, and I hope you've found some use in this. And the next one's going to be done by Ruth, I believe. So there's a whole series of these coming up. So thank you very much. Thank you.